Uh, Great. Welcome to the Jordan Center to all of you who are here physically or virtually. My name is Rasim Jagalov. I teach in the Russian and Slavic Studies department here. And it's really my great pleasure to be introducing Professor Vladimir Tikhonov. Actually doubly great because he just made it to this event, having had his flight from Columbus canceled and arriving just an hour or so ago in New York, and great pleasure also because I've been following his work for many years now, and it's really wonderful to bring him, to be able to bring him to the Jordan Center finally. So Professor Vladimir Tikhonov, his Korean name is Pak Noja, is a professor of Korean and East Asian Studies at the Department of Culture Studies and Oriental Languages at Oslo University. Previously, he taught at Kyung-hee University at Seoul, and his research focuses on the history of modern ideas in Korea, and more recently on the Korean Communist movement. He has published numerous books which have established him as one of the leading scholars of 19th and 20th century Korea, namely his Socialism and Darwinism, his social Darwinism and nationalism in Korea, the beginning from 2010, as well as modern Korea and its others, perceptions of the neighboring countries and Korean modernity in 2015. He has also co-authored Intellectuals in Between, Koreans in a Changing World, 1850 to 1945, and co-edited Buddhist Modernities, Reinventing Tradition in the Globalizing World, as well as Military Chaplaincy in an Era of Religious Pluralism. His most recent book, which we have gathered to hear about today, is The Red Decades, Communism is Movement and Culture in Korea, 1919 to 1945, which came out last year from the University of Hawaii Press. What this distinguished academic record does not capture is Professor Tikhonov's fascinating biography. A graduate of the renowned Eastern Faculty of St. Petersburg University, he went on to study and subsequently teach in South Korea, becoming Korean by citizenship, marriage, and culture. Nor does this record say much about his activism, which puts him in a relationship to many of the heroes of his last book.
Thank you so much. As well as in Korea, you would have said the introduction is much better than the introduction. Anyways, thank you for the introduction. And without further ado, I'm going now to move to my book. Well, the book is mostly about Korean socialism in the interwar period, but I also tried to use it as a background to explain the trajectory of radical social movements, especially Marxian socialism in South Korea mostly. North Korea is a separate story. South Korea mostly after 1945. So my ambition was to try to give some sort of a long-term, long-period view of Marxian socialism in Korea after liberation South Korea from its beginnings. I'm going to talk about it 1919 and to the present time. Well, I remember there was recently means I think something around 8 or 9 years. There was recently a book on Korean socialism, mostly post-1945, which in its title had this expression, failed experiment. Korean socialism as failure. Well, failure, what does that mean? In this world, I mean, what are the successes and what are failures? We're talking about success of South Korean industrialization. We don't count the causes of the workers who died because of industrial accidents in the process of achieving those successes. Well, in the way is that Marxian socialists in South Korea never came any time close to taking power and probably will come anyway close to taking power in the foreseeable future. Okay, if you mean this, yes, it's perhaps was a failure. However, there are also some other aspects, and even without having taken the power, Marxian socialists in Korea left lasting impact. And that's what I tried to, in a way, flesh out of their long history, those long-term differences they made, long-term gains that Korea got, at least partly as a result of Marxian socialist activity. And for example, South Korea was for a very long time serious problem with human rights of their pupils in the school, of the students, and at the very end, well, 13 years ago, it was at last prohibited to physically punish them, and the man behind this prohibition was a Marxian sociologist who became educational superintendent or so. So, well, some sort of contribution it is, I guess. Or, for example, so-called successful South Korean industrialism was practically no welfare state, welfare-less state for a very long time. And some elements of welfare state came into being in the beginning of this century, partly as a result of competition between a social democratic party, which I'm going to talk about, and the centrists who got power. And then, for example, by 1990s became a commonplace to talk about peaceful unification in Korea. But it's not how things were in the beginning in the 1950s. Unification was march to the north. It was anything but peaceful. So say, and one of the first persons who actually coined this expression, peaceful unification, was Cho Bon-am. He was executed later as North Korean spy. He, of course, was not a spy. Well, but it wasn't only in Stalin's Soviet Union that people were framed as spies, you know. But what I just wanted to mention is that Cho Bon-am was an important communist leader of 20s and 30s, and it's because I'm going to talk more about it, graduate of the KUT, Communist University of the Oriental Forest. So I'm going to talk about it later, so that's why I make this point. So it was actually Cho Bon-am's invention, the very expression of unification. So what I'm trying to suggest is that Marxian socialists, of course, never took power in South Korea and probably will not do it anytime soon. But they were an important moving force behind lots of things that have been happening in South Korea. And from that, I'm going to spool back and go now to the starting point of socialist wave on the Korean Peninsula. Global revolution, global post-First World War revolution, a result of what you can call a multiple overlapping crisis of the post-war world. Political crisis generated by the war, economical crisis generated by the end of the war, because the end of the war means slump. Health crisis generated by the war, global pandemic. All those overlapping crises produced multiple revolutions almost everywhere. And if you look into the world in 1919, I wonder if there were any peaceful places at that point. You could find Soviets in such places as rural Norway and provincial Ireland, not to speak about major revolutions in the places which I noticed here. And it was 1919 that Korea had its mass anti-colonial movement, which inaugurated the period of, well, contestors, radicalized 1920s, the time when the masses started moving. 1920s in Korea was the time when, well, in a way, workers and peasants started to understand themselves as class for themselves. Class consciousness came into being, approximately, they started coming into being. At that time, struggles were everywhere, and it was out of those struggles that communist movements started to emerge. What we had were mostly former nationalists, in many cases Christian nationalists. Well, it's famous story of Kim Il-sung's father being a Protestant nationalist. Kim Il-sung himself being a missionary schoolboy. So his mother being a Presbyterian elder. She was from Presbyterian elders family. So, but that's typical story. Protestant nationalists becoming communists. That's very typical story. So it was across this background that the people who were previously Christian nationalists or something like that started to remove themselves as communists. And one important actor in this process was, of course, Comintern. The thing is that it's very regrettable, I think, that people often just take Comintern's history as part of Soviet history. Comintern and Soviet Union were, of course, interrelated, but were not the same. The Soviet Union was a complex formation. It was, on the one hand, a post-revolutionary state. On the other hand, it was a geo-body of Russian Empire carried over after the revolution. So it obviously, in some aspects, it just inherited certain things from Russian Empire. It could not disown it completely. Comintern, however, had no geo-body. It was planetary movement with headquarters in Moscow, but really planetary. Comintern activists were thoroughly international, and importantly, Comintern was the first case European socialist movement seriously took the colonial question. Socialists, I mean moderate socialists, never did it before, and some examples are just shameful, like Bernstein saying that actually imperialists do the needed dirty work for progress. So imperialism is good because in the end they bring capitalism, and that's progress. This is the logic of the new right in South Korea today. So some moderate social democrats were just completely shameful. Pro-colonialist communists differed on that score, and it meant a huge enlargement, a huge furthering of radicalism. Also, it had something to do with the practical tasks of the Soviet state. Isolated in Europe, Soviet state needed allies in Asia. Obviously, that was the way it could get those allies. Comintern was a planetary global movement which needed education to further its goals. And when it comes to Korea, the two schools are especially important: International Lenin School, where the leaders of Korean Communist movement studied, and KUTF, which I have just mentioned as a place where Cho Bonam studied at, the person who was executed as North Korean spy, but who actually was the father of the peaceful unification. So those schools were of enormous importance for Korean Communist movement. In case of KUTF, it shows an interesting point about early Soviet experience. In early Soviet Union, there was not a strict division between domestic and international. Originated as basically a place where non-Russian cadres were to study in their own languages. That was a very important point because many of them didn't speak Russian. So say, but then it was enlarged into a global educational organization, as I have written here in 1924, 62 nationalities. And it's quite important because, say, Koreans at KUTF mostly didn't speak Russian, didn't understand Russian, which means that the classes were to be interpreted or taught by Korean cadres. But it was the same for each and every nationality. So KUTF was an enormous knowledge-producing apparatus with students who were getting Marxist education in their own language. Not only Marxist education, they also were getting military training. And people who were researching on colonial problems, and this knowledge being disseminated in a variety of languages. It was enormous apparatus of knowledge production, knowledge dissemination. And when Korean communists were getting people to be sent to KUTF, and Korean newspapers were writing about the Japanese spies were doing everything possible and impossible to find out how many Koreans and Japanese were in KUTF. So in Japanese spy communications, you find, for example, statistics for KUTF. For 1928, around 1,000 students quite precise statistics, actually. So it was of keen interest to them. For Chinese, there was, in the end, a special university of their own, Sun Yat-sen Communist University. So this could produce more than 200 Korean revolutionaries. And their role in Korean socialist movement is hard to overestimate. So I say it was a way to transfer knowledge, skills, understanding from the places which had rich revolutionary experience to Korea where the things were just beginning. So it was an enormous experiment in transfer of knowledge, organizational skills, all this sort of institutional know-how. So very, very important point, not only in communist Korean history, just in general Korean history. It's generally Comintern also, aside from KUT, did a lot to merge together different factions of Korean communist movement into one party, which was formalized in 1925, 1926, Comintern recognized Korean Communist Party. There was notorious tendency to factionism there, which is understandable because there were just too many different people in the movement. Obviously, different people with different backgrounds. You had Soviet Koreans who were completely bilingual, like Kim Mang-gyong, and you had Koreans from Korea proper who came to Soviet Union as Korean cadres, national cadres. Yoon Jae-yeon was one example. So to say, you had activists with very diverse backgrounds who didn't necessarily trust each other, who had their own understandings, principles, and interests, but still Comintern was an important tool in crafting a party out of mass of different groups and circles. And this party was, despite the relatively low numbers, so we understand that there were, say, 265 members, 1926, but we should remember, by the way, the Japanese Communist Party wasn't necessarily much bigger. And who were those members? Around 70 out of those 265 members were journalists. That is, the people whose job was to produce and disseminate knowledge, popularize knowledge, which means, I mean, one journalist has the power of opinion leading power equal to hundreds of people in a society before social media. So in this way, it was mighty party because it was a party of opinion leaders, basically. It also had relatively big budget, mostly subsidized by Comintern and lots of local work, lots of local representatives. The way how the party interacted with Comintern is eerily similar to all of us who have relationship with funding bodies. Well, you see, I work for Association for Korean Studies in Europe, heading it for this moment, so we are being funded by Korean organizations. We submit our plan, we get the budget, we spend the budget, we send the report. That's approximately how things work. So in 1920s, so Secretary General of Korean Communist Party would send the funding request to Moscow, and then you had the report here. Strikes organized, peasant strikes organized, tenants movement, here, there, campaigns organized, and so on and so on. What is interesting is that if you look into Comintern documents, Comintern had its own referents. Wow, how is he referent in English? Well, say
Consultants.
Consultants, well, people in charge of Korea, Soviet Koreans mostly, and they were making abstracts of the relevant articles from colonial Korean press. And what's interesting is that if you look into the materials that they sent to the leadership of Comintern, they were basically checking the reports of Korean Communist Party, whether all those struggles that Comintern financed, whether they really happened, what were the results. So we have a usual bureaucratic procedure which we are still using. Funding body grants the funds and then checks the results. Well, which, however, Korean communists had, compared to Japanese colleagues, one important advantage. They didn't have much competition. Their competition were anarchists, obviously, because anarchists had their own unions and their own following and so on. In case of Japan, however, there were legal social democratic parties since 1926, and lots of unions were following them because you could send their deputies they could send people to parliament, they could fight for some real improvements and so on. So Japanese communists had to compete with anarchists and social democrats. Korean communists had no social democratic competition. In Korea, there was no suffrage. So social democrats could not grow there at that time. So what I just wanted to show also is that Japanese police took the communist threat very seriously. Communists, actually more communists than anarchists, were the main target for colonial police, which used terrible instruments for repression. And those Korean communists were not simply unthinking proxies of Comintern. As I have said, the relationship between them and Comintern resembled in a way relationship between scholars, for example, and finding bodies in today's world. But as you understand from your own life, I guess, scholars have their interest, finding bodies have their interest, and they just have somehow to compromise. In a way, they have to find common denominators, compromises, and so on. It was pretty much the same in the interrelationship between Korean communists and Comintern. There was lots of hard diplomacy, lobbying, different factions on both sides, complex interrelationship, and Koreans being very active agents and trying to get from Comintern what they needed without surrendering their own interests, finding allies, in a way, making changes. So they were anything but blind followers of Comintern. The agency was very strong. It's very, very obvious from the documents which we have. And it's also important to remember that even without Comintern, the struggle was continuing. I mean, with minimal or no support from Comintern. In some cases, Comintern's support for the struggles in the 1930s, when there was no longer organized, acknowledged party, the party was de facto defunct since 1929. Japanese just arrested most of its scholars. So, but even without the party, struggles were continuing, growing. The party was striking roots here and there. And in some cases, like for example, there was lots of important activism in the northernmost part of Korea, like Myeongchon County. There you had Hyun Chil-bon and other graduates of the KUT who were coming from Moscow and doing lots of interesting things, organizing some sort of liberated areas, organizing peasant self-defense groups, terrorizing local rich people, destroying their documents, clashing with Japanese police. So trying to, well, their model were obviously Chinese communists, their local Soviet areas. So here the Comintern support was in the form of education that the activists would get from KUT, together with military training, so to say. And there were some local struggles which actually Comintern even didn't know about, which means that Korean communists could perfectly exist even without Comintern. They had lots of support from the bottom, so to say. There was, for example, movement by EJU, an important communist organizer in Seoul in mid-1930s, and EJU organized unions, led strikes, led student movement, and so on, following democratic troika principle. Instead of one person leading the organizations, it was collective leadership. He was promoting, he had no direct connection to community, in fact, but he could still fight, partly also because of Korean-Japanese alliance. There were also Japanese communists in Korea, and they played enormously important role, especially this one, Miyake Konosuke, a KG Imperial University professor who actually kept EGU in his own house for several weeks because Japanese police couldn't even imagine that a professor would keep a communist shielding him from police manhunt. So Miyake Shikanosuke trained the cadres of academic Marxists at Keiji Imperial University. And by 1930s, with minimal interference from Comintern, academic Marxism in Korea had very little to do with Moscow. It was mostly product of Japanese academic institutions. So with absolutely minimal interference from Moscow, we get very interesting examples of Japanese Marxist philosophical, political, literary, historical thought in Korea, which changed very much Korean academia, Korean knowledge, Korean discourses on history, and so on. For example, in Marxist philosophy, Pak Chiu, one of the disciples of Miyake Shikanosuke and other Japanese academic Marxists, was an important voice trying to relativize the idea of the national and arguing that nationalists were completely wrong, essentializing Korean culture. Culture is a product of history and lots of different influences. I mean, in today's terms, Pak Chiu's idea of nation, nationality, and national culture would have been termed constructivist. There was no such word at that time, but he was a bit ahead of his time, I guess. So, and he was an important anti-nationalist voice in the debates of the 1930s. It's interesting to read Pak Chiu today. One of his hobbies was to criticize Heidegger. Well, he read German, obviously, his main language was German. So, but it was partly also because Heidegger was so influential in Japan at that time. And I was trying to analyze why Heidegger is so obsessed with this Sorge, this sort of disquiet, fear. Well, he thought that Heideggerian philosophy is a symptom, basically, a symptom of terminal illness of late times. Capitalist culture in the times when capitalism is entering its final stage. So it's symptom, in a way, of some big disease, some big illness in the very heart of capitalism. And instead of Heideggerian disquiet, Heideggerian sense of alienation and complete loneliness, sense of being thrown away into the world, Pak proposed another ideal of historically aware individual who was perfectly understanding the historical role this individual was to play. An individual with the sense of history, an individual able to historicize all the discourses around and oneself. Generally, historicism, this focus on historical and dialectic understanding of things, is very much the core of Pak Chiu's philosophy. Well, I would call Pak Chiu Korea's Tosaka Jun, in a way, the person who basically put Korean Marxist philosophy on the proper way. It's too bad that he is very little known in the Anglosphere. But Pak Chiu, there were lots of Marxist philosophers, economists, political scientists, journalists who were discussing a number of topics in the 1930s. Comintern had little relationship. For example, the laws of capitalist accumulation and the law of the impoverishment of the proletariat was being discussed with Korea as an example, or the role of social democracy in the age of crisis and fascism, or, for example, phenomenon of nationalism. Communists were trying to de-essentialize national culture, history, and so on. But vis-a-vis nationalists, they were not simply critical, but they were also analytical and dialectical. They saw nationalism, just like Heidegger, as a symptom of something. And in case of nationalism, it was a symptom of the facilitation of this middling position of small national bourgeoisie, who were neither compradors big enough to side with Japanese, nor proletarians brave enough to fight them. So they were in between, and nationalism was their banner. So, and on the basis of this, Korean Marxists believed that some sort of united front might have been possible with nationalists, of course, under certain conditions. So it was an attempt to historicize nationalism in a dialectical way. And I think it was an important attempt, rather well done. And especially interesting is the work of Marxist scholars on Korean history. Their attempt to re-semanticize the things which were so much mythologized by nationalists. Well, Japan had its Yamato Tamashii, which Tosaka Jun was fighting against. Korea had its own kind of Yamato Tamashii, was Hwaran spirit, a spirit of the aristocratic fighters of Silva. Marxist scholars were trying to show that Hwarans were basically aristocratic military corps performing also magic and didn't have this sort of ahistorical spirit representing nation. They didn't represent any nation, they represented themselves. So, well, and you see fight of Japanese Marxists against Yamato Tamashii like concepts, the Japanese spirit. Korean Marxists were doing the same, and I would say they were doing it well in the similar way. It just has to be remembered that communists were the only people who continued to struggle against colonialism, also in the worst time of war and repression during the Pacific War. Was a communist group in Korean capital, and there were several cases of them being arrested en masse, but someone remained at large, and the group continued to exist until the liberation. So communists never gave up in a way, and which compares quite interestingly to, for example, mainstream nationalists, moderate nationalists inside Korea, mostly switched to pro-war, pro-imperialist stance at that time. Some communists did, some at least. Well, so what happened after the 1945, the year zero, as Jan Buruma famously called it? I mean, to say it very easy, I can formulate it this way. Communism, colonial era communism in Northern Korea, northern part of Korea occupied by Soviet army, it was basically co-opted. Soviet Union had its own candidate to lead North Korea, Kim Il-sung. So to say, but his administration, at least in the beginning, included lots of colonial era activists. Most of them were then phased out, purged in a way, so that Kim Il-sung make his leadership monolithic, but at least in the beginning, colonial underground was just called by the Soviets and their representatives. Well, so in North Korea, it was cooptation and then some purges. Not everyone was purged, by the way. Some colonial Marxists actually remained active and continued in North Korea until 70s, 80s, 90s. So in South Korea, instead of cooptation, South Korea was destined to become an anti-communist bulwark of American empire. In East Asia, so it wasn't cooptation, it was massacre. Communists or anyone suspected to be leftist, you didn't have to be communist to be killed. So say, or anyone police disliked. So they were killed en masse in huge numbers. So, and two Koreas were going into different directions. North Korea developed in the 50s a developmentalist regime where basically the whole state became, in essence, one big enterprise in a way. But that meant something. I mean, if you have only that many workers and the numbers couldn't be increased, so you had to take care for their education and their medical conditions because you wouldn't get any other workers from elsewhere. So which means that state organized is a huge factor. Also, by necessity, had to become a welfare state. So North Korea developed a high-level mobilization statehood, very quick industrialization, and elements of welfare, which were actually quite unparalleled in their third world of the 1950s. And by the end of 1950s, North Korea was the place where you could get free medicine, free education, and even free apartment. So after you graduated, I mean. So it was the first ever third world welfare state, in essence. Well, that's why Che Guevara called Pyongyang paradise when he visited Pyongyang. Wow. It sounds a bit queer those days, but anyway. He was a doctor. He obviously wanted Cuba to become a welfare state like North Korea, which happened at the consequence. I can understand that. So this welfareism obviously had its socioeconomical grounds. It wasn't charity. It was something state needed. But well, Western European welfare states also fulfilled certain tasks of capitalist accumulation because they created large mass of consumers whom capitalism needed for extended accumulation also. In this way, you can find some parallels between North Korean welfareism and social democratic welfareism in Western Europe. In South Korea, however, from the 60s, it was export-oriented economy without any welfare. It was to be export-oriented. Basically, it was to become a cheap assembly line, a producer of cheap goods for the developed markets. And the workers, I mean, in North Korea, workers were co-opted in a way. They were to become part of this left-wing authoritarian corporate state. In South Korea, they were excluded, not co-opted. And those who tried to fight for workers' interests, the social democrats of South Korea, some of them, like Cho Bonam, being former communists, well, they were killed mostly. So this process of killing off the leftists continued throughout 60s and 70s. We see the same patterns. Marxist intellectuals in the deep underground trying to build some anti-establishmentalist circles. They read Das Kapital in Japanese. They try to import American Marxists, Sweeney, Baran, and well, whatever you could import from America in the 50s and 60s. And then the intelligence finds them out, frames them as North Korean spy and kills them. So the same pattern was continuing all the time. So, and you see in late 1970s, the people who were imprisoned as North Korean spies numbered around 1,000. We know now that North Korea had around 50 persons who could be described as spies. The rest were just basically plucked up because authorities didn't like them. Mostly they were leftist intellectuals of some sort. There were constant attempts to build a socialist, Marxist socialist party underground. Some of those attempts, like this Front of National Liberation of South Korea, are really heroic. It all didn't work, however, because they didn't manage to develop a large following in the working class. That was the key. In 1970s, it still didn't work, and things really only changed in the 1980s. Korean capitalism matured, workers started to perceive themselves as a class with its own interests, and radicalized intellectuals could proletarianize themselves and forge some sort of alliance between workers and radicalized middle classes, the students. This alliance, however, was fraught with its own contradictions, which sometimes just replayed the old debates of the 1920s. Inside the movement, Korean movement of the late 80s, for example, there was a famous debate between Orthodox Marxists and left nationalists. And it's interesting because in the 1920s, you had two major factions in Korean communist movement, and one, Seoul Shanghai faction, was more left nationalist. They wanted very close alliance with nationalistic anti-colonialists. And another, the Tuesday Society and Irkutsk Communist Party. They wanted more class-based approach. It's interesting how those things are just being replayed throughout history. So this movement was fraught with its own contradictions. It was very heterogeneous, but it was one important element in this concoction. that in the end pushed South Korea to participatory pluralist politics, and which gave an opportunity for South Korean working class to get at least some social and political rights, so to say. However, here it was also the seat of the crisis in the movement. In the early 1990s, two things coincided. Soviet Union died, and South Korea became a middle income country with a very compared, in a way, split working class. Workers at large enterprises became more or less middle class, while those in small enterprises, non-permanent workers, women, and so on, they were still basically poor paid proletarians. But anyway, this fragmentation of working class also meant, together with the loss of the Soviet ideals, that leftist movement in South Korea, after a brief spark of the 1980s, went into crisis mode. Things, however, were changed by Asian financial crisis and the imposition of neoliberalism upon unwilling South Korean population. So imposition of neoliberalism in the beginning basically meant wage oppression. Wages were depressed in order to make profitability higher and relaunch South Korean capitalism in the new neoliberal form. It sparked lots of protests. There was huge outgrowth, sort of wave of resistance in the beginning of the century because of all the suffering neoliberal restructuring imposed on the working people in South Korea, and that gave new life to socialist movement. But still, South Korea has its national security law. You can't call yourself Communist Party. So if you want to organize a Marxist socialist party, you should call it Socialist Party, Progressive Socialist Party, or something like this. No communism. Otherwise, it will end very soon and very sadly. So a social democratic Korean Democratic Labour Party was born out of those anti-neoliberal struggles. It had its own problems, however, because it heavily relied on richer unions mostly with mostly members from large enterprises, permanent male middle-aged workers who already lived their lives very different from those of flexibilized, non-permanent female or foreign proletarians. So it was already very fragmented working class, and this fragmentation, together with emergence of what Lenin would have called labor aristocracy, that is, labor bureaucrats who very easily came into sort of, basically were co-opted by management, bought off, in many cases, very literally bought off. So emergence of this layer of trade union bureaucrats who were easy selling themselves to the management, it all brought additional problems to South Korea's socialist movement, since it relied so much on organized labor. During the last 20 years in South Korea, really important struggles were mostly by non-permanent workers, and especially female non-permanent workers. Those days in South Korean campuses, many students are very conservative, especially in more prestigious universities. It costs a lot to be students. So, well, you have to pay lots of tuition. So to say, and the most radical people on the campuses of those universities are female cleaners. They organize, they struggle, they strike. So to say, and sometimes students solidarize with them, sometimes they don't. So to say, so really important struggles were mostly led by most dispossessed, most oppressed proletarians, and it often was intersecting with gender and nationality. Foreigners and women always suffer more than everybody else. You have some elements of Korean popular culture based on those epic struggles of female proletariat. of South Korea in the recent days. Well, basically what we had in the last 20-25 years was this process of struggle, contestation, the efforts of socialists to build more radicalized workers' movements there, and the efforts of government and business to split the workers up off in a way to compartmentalize working class, to repress harsher some elements of socialist or social democratic movement. The left nationalists are notoriously easy to repress because they may harbor sympathetic views of North Korea. And even if you say Kim Il-sung was a good fellow, in Syria you can go to prison, and in South Korea you praise the enemy. So to say so if you're left nationalist, it's very easy to get you to prison. So the government used that. Left nationalists were targeted selectively for harsher repression. Social democrats were grudgingly tolerated. Some workers were given some perks, some were not. And this divide and rule policy more or less worked. However, social democratic movement with its fundament in organized labor was fighting political battles on welfarist platform. Centrists, the liberals, were competing with social democrats for votes, and to do so, they needed to do something for the workers. So South Korea gradually, slowly, but surely was becoming a sort of welfare state. And I think some role was played in that by organized labor and socialist movement. Well, you see those days in South Korea, the national medical insurance scheme, and on average, 70 to 73% of your medical costs are being reimbursed by the state if you join the scheme. In the United States, we don't have it. So obviously, so when on this account, South Korea is more of a welfare state than America is going to become great once again now. So to say, and I just wanted to make sure that you understand the contribution of social democratic movement in this development. And yet another contribution was the emergence of peace-based approach towards North Korea. In the 50s, if you were mentioning like Cho Nam, good graduate whom I had just mentioned, if you were mentioning peaceful unification, you could be framed as North Korean spy killed. Now that's mainstream. Now the disgraced president Yoon Suk-yeol, with his obdurate anti-communism, is actually non-mainstream. Peaceful, the talks of North-South peace is mainstream. So to say, so what socialist movement managed was to mainstreamize its peace-oriented platform. So now I think I already used up my 40-something minutes and I have to jump to some conclusions. So what can we basically conclude? There was a time in the 1920s and 1930s when a time which I called red decades because communist movement then was major historical actor. Well, not only in Korea, it was elsewhere the same, more or less. So the struggles of this period resulted in general shift to the left in post-war period. Golden age of capitalism until mid-70s was also a golden age of moderate left. But much of those gains were possible because of the struggles of the pre-war period and the existence of Soviet Union. So obviously you had to compete with other kind of industrialism. So you had to get something on offer. In case of South Korea, in case of Korea, what happened was that Korea was split into a Soviet-type state where the workers were co-opted as a class, and the export-based pro-American dictatorship, where the workers were excluded, and despite enormously harsh repression, Marxian socialism was resuscitated, in a way resurrected in the 1980s as a mass movement, because it became an ideology of the excluded workers, an ideology which showed them how to gain social and political rights. What it resulted in was the compromise of the late 80s, South Korean democratization, and then shift to new neoliberal conditions where the working class was fragmented, divided, and neoliberal governmentality could develop on the basis of this compartmentalization of the working class. However, the fight is not over. South Korea still has much higher number of days lost to strike than Japan, for example, where this number is close to 0. And also, interesting statistics would be those of unionization in South Korea. Despite all the witch hunt against unionists, despite so many unionists being harassed, persecuted, driven to suicide, suicides of unionists used to be almost commonplace. I mean, there dozens of people self-immolated in South Korea in the recent decades. The world hardly took notice, but anyway. So that despite all this, despite savage repression, unionization is growing, numbers are growing. So labor movement still remains very much the backbone of progressive movement in South Korea. And there is also a generally strong feeling that we need a strong party on the left, because otherwise the center, struggling center, would not be able to check and balance the fascists on the extreme right. Well, I'm talking now about fascism in South Korea, and perhaps before December 3rd last year, you could think that I'm exaggerating, but now you understand I know. There are real fascists in South Korea. The people who planned and tried to execute a coup d'etat, and who planned to arrest and execute up to 500 leading liberals. So to say, prohibit everyone from leaving the country, and basically make Korea perpetual dictatorship. So we have real fascists in Korea. So they tried to gain power. So far they failed, but it's not there. So, and if we want to keep fascism in check, we need not only center, the liberals, but we also need a stronger party on the left. And again, the legacy from the red decades is coming to the play. The sky, it's still there, it has to be someone. Well, I guess that I'm always done with my monologue, that let's try to turn it into a dialogue.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. I have.
I stop sharing.
No. You can, like, and maybe you can call on people who have their own questions. I'm only because we also have a Zoom audience of 14, and there may be questions from those. So I would, ask you to maybe to let me know via chat. If you're a virtual audience member with a question, so that we can arrange your unmuting. And but maybe let us first start with questions from the physical audience. that you can go upon.
Yes, and please introduce you when you ask questions.
Yes.
Know whom I talked to.
My name is Jae, and I'm an assistant professor in East Asian department at NYU. And thank you for a great talk, and it was really engaging. So the first question is that the subtitle of your book has communism as a keyword. And then you started your presentation by saying the legacy and history of socialism. So I was wondering whether you are using socialism and communism interchangeably. And then if so, do you think there is a utility, conceptual utility in differentiating socialism and communism?
Well,
let me
sorry,
so that other people may have more time to ask their questions. So I have a couple more, but let me brief. The second thing is about the legacy of this movement. You said a bunch of things, and you mentioned the social welfare as one of the positive legacy, and then you also mentioned peace on the Korean Peninsula as another positive legacy from the socialist movement. But I was also wondering during your presentation, such as the stories of purges and executions and so on, and then you also described that there's the radicalization and education, and it doesn't really connect very well, peace and radicalization and also execution and so on. And then I was also wondering, you mentioned that in your slide, there's a North and South Korean, Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il shaking hands, this iconic picture. Is it legacy of socialism movement? Or is it, in my mind, actually, I think it's an effect of, not to be dramatic, but yeah, I think it's totally possible that that happened, that this rapprochement between North and South Korea was possible because of ongoing capitalist greed. So that think about these giant corporations in South Korea, Hyundai, going to North Korea, saying that, oh, we are bringing peace. But at the same time, they're thinking, oh, cheap labor, we are enabling peace. But behind it, not so much of socialist legacy, but for me, it's more capitalist ongoing dynamic for expansion and exploitation is what I think. And lastly, I was wondering, what do you think of the aspect of gender? There was really, I'm curious about. You mentioned that there was the female workers on campus and so on. And then Yoon Suk-yeol was elected largely because of this male chauvinism. Let's go back to the glorious times when women were docile, right? And then is there any legacy during the socialist movement that it was again? You said it's a mass-based, but was it also patriarchal in the sense that they created this condition for the female further, denigration and the reaction made possible? And yeah, there.
Okay, if I would be allowed to start. Well, to begin with, difference between socialism and communism. Well, in theory, in post-October Revolution world, we say socialism when we are talking about all Marxian socialists, including social democrats and communists. In Korean case, however, it's funny to think, but Sahwee-Ju and Kong San-ju socialist movement, communist movement, historians usually use it interchangeably because there were actually very few social democrats in colonial Korea. There were some. They mostly were from a communist. So in 1930s, Yoon Hyun, for example, basically was a social democrat. Pe Sung-yong, famous economist critic, he was a social democrat. Both were from a communist. So to say, but they were intellectuals. It was part of intellectual world. As mass for social democracy never developed in Korea, because Koreans were not given suffrage in the Japanese Empire, so legal parliamentary movement, it simply didn't work in Korean case. So in Korean case, yes, it's often used interchangeably, also in genuine history, of course. Socialism would include social democrats, communism excludes them. So to say. Then the next question was about peacefulness supposed and radicalization. The thing is that those things, I mean, in a country where at any point a war can start, and if war starts in Korea, we are going to have several tens of thousands of people dying every day. So to say, this level of violence is child's play. I mean, compared to what can happen in case of a real war between two Koreas. So say, by the way, it's quite interesting that what Korean radicals could do at the best or worst scenario, depending on what your attitude is. Well, they could throw Molotov cocktails. That was the peak. I mean, you wouldn't go further than that. And it's quite interesting because in Japan, you had lots of radicalism going much further than that. Red Army, Sekigun-ha, and so on. So they didn't happen in South Korea, and it's very obvious why. Because South Korea is a garrison state. I mean, it's very militarized. And it's quite obvious that as soon as radicals start arming themselves and using firearms, they all will end up in prison forever. So to say, so the state has absolute power to do so. It's very easy. So to say, so it means that the violence that the protesters could use had very obvious upper limits. And the protesters had to be very careful not to overstep sort of limits. It's still an extremely militarized horizon state. So when it comes to peaceful unification and Kim Dae-jung, the funny thing is that Kim Dae-jung originally was a member of Kongguk Chunbi Tongmeng. So say, and the head of this Kongbukchunbitonmen, the Committee for Preparation for National Independence, was Yoon Hyun. Yoon Hyun was former communist, and by the way, translator of the Communist Manifesto into Korean. And then he moved to social democracy, and Kim Dae-jung started basically social democrat. When it comes to Kim Dae-jung's ideas, they were complex. Kim Dae-jung of the 1970s was moderate social democrat who had to perform as a liberal in South Korean environment. In the moment you say you are social democrat, you will go to prison. 1970s. Then he moved further to the right in the 1990s. His ideas on peace, however, I mean, to which degree it was capitalist profit-making, it's an interesting question. You know, it's now defunct, perhaps forever, but there was at some point industrial zone, Kaesong industrial zone, near South Korean border in North Korea, where exploited North Korean proletarians were getting $120 equivalent to $120 a month, and were producing things for South Korean corporations. The funny thing is, when it still existed, none of the major corporate giants ever invested there. You wouldn't find Samsung's there. No, Hyundai invested in different projects, and it all failed. So to say, LG had almost no investment in North Korea. Samsung never invested in North Korea properly, and so on and so on. So the thing is that if you talk to people from LG or Samsung, I mean, I'm sorry to say it, the interest in North Korea is zero. Because if you simply want cheap, exploitable labor, you go to Cambodia, you don't go to North Korea. North Korea is not only cheap labor, it's also very obstinate bureaucracy, which wants its own cut, and which sets the administrative rent very high. Asan Hyundai had project Kumgang, the Diamond Mountain Tourism Project. It failed completely. It never produced profit. So as a capitalist enterprise, it was completely. And the reason was that North Koreans demanded very high rent. So to say, they didn't want to sell themselves on cheap. So it ended up with the whole enterprise being bankrupt. So if you are a capitalist and you are greedy, you should go to Cambodia, not North Korea. And when it comes to all those peaceful approaches and so on, I mean, more than capitalist greed, I think it's about general formulation of what Korean Peninsula, North and South Korea should be. Because if we make a sustainable, protracted peace regime in Korea, it means that we can then do something that Koreans never could do after the war, reduce the number of people in South Korea. Today, South Korean army is around 600,000 people. It's one of the biggest standing armies in the world. So if we have peace regime, we can start reducing it. But then it means demilitarizing South Korea. And this is a major change. So to say, so peace on Korean Peninsula is basically a question of what kind of country we are going to have. Is it going to be Harrison state as before? Or are we going to build something different? So say it's much more than simply profits. Because when it comes to profits, South Koreans already economically colonized much of Southeast Asia. That's where money comes from, actually.
Hi, I'm Kieran Mordecai Electric. Kieran Mordecai Electric, my Korean name is Yan Woo. But my question is regarding, so in your book, there's a lot of talk about sort of the transnationality of the Red Decade amongst sort of the Korean diaspora. So in sort of an early Soviet days with like the policy of Koreanizatsiya and such, you have this Korean autonomous, this idea of this Korean autonomous region, you know? So my question is, in sort of this period before expulsion to Central Asia, is there, in the broader Korean diaspora, an understanding about what's going on within sort of the cadres of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and more broadly the Koryo-Soram that are there? Because like with the Jewish Autonomous Republic, you had ICOR, right? And for various different other reasons, there is sort of recruitment for settlement in the Jewish Autonomous Republic, but I didn't know whether there was any sort of understanding more broadly outside of the Soviet Union.
Well, Birobidzhan was obviously a reference for Soviet Koreans. When you see, I came here from Ohio, Columbus. We have AAS, American Association for Asian Studies conference, and my presentation was exactly on Soviet Koreans, on a Soviet Korean poet and cadre, communist cadre called Cheholim, and his poem, Sibiri Choltoheng, riding train in Siberia. And the poem is a sort of recreation of Soviet Korean universe in Siberia. It's basically a description of the space from Vladivostok to Chita. And while the poet was riding the train, looking around and thinking about history of Russian Soviet Koreans in this area, and very important landmark was Birobidzhan. And in this text of that poem, you have the stanza that ethnic policies of Leninism are sacred. Jewish people didn't have their state for 2,000 years, and now Lenin gave them their state. So to say, Red Zion. Red Zion was something that really Soviet Koreans wanted to recreate, obviously. So this was that was a model, but in case of Birobidzhan, you mentioned ICOR. So there were American money companies. So to say, and America was a big cow, and you always want to milk a cow. So to say, I mean, in the 20s and 30s, America still was great in a way. I mean, it was really a cow to milk. And in case of Soviet Koreans, obviously, there were no foreign cows waiting for milking. So the question was first put to the party committee for Primoria for the maritime province, I think in 1925, a question on possible establishment of Korean national autonomy. Koreans had village ethno-national Soviets, which means that basically village Soviets in Korean villages could proceed administration in Korean, so to say. And they had smaller autonomous units here and there, but that was on level several villages, not more. So say, Soviet Korean activists wanted more. They wanted a real autonomy, like Soviet Tataria, Soviet Bashkiria, Soviet Korea. That never worked. And the reason where mostly objections came from Moscow. Comintern was in favor of this because it was a very good bait, in a way, to make a quasi-state, quasi-Korean state just in full view of oppressed Koreans in Japan colonized Korea. That was something Comintern really wanted. Ministry of Foreign, People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs was against. Exactly because they didn't want to provoke Japan too far. So to say, as I have said, Comintern obviously wasn't a territorial state, so it wasn't exactly the same as Soviet state. Soviet state was a weird combination of post-revolutionary activist state with basically Russian Empire reborn under a different banner. And there were bureaucratic institutions like the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, which mostly fought for the interests of this reborn territorial Russian state, so to say. And Comintern had very different policies. Thing is that it's I wonder if somebody researched on that, the unending discussions and disputes between Comintern and People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs in the 1990s. So on Korean and Japanese question especially. So well, no, the issue was there, it was debated, but it was question of foreign policy and it was question of the security of Soviet borders, because it was considered sensitive border area. So discussions were there, but it was never, nothing was ever adopted. So, and then Koreans were sent to Central Asia.
Yes. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Esa. I'm a grad student. I have two questions, if I may. One is just how large basically does the, and sorry, both of these questions come a little bit out of place of ignorance, but the first question is like, how large does the peasant question, I guess, loom in those factional debates in the 20s and the 30s, like in all those discussions that you cited, like does the peasantry basically always come in as this agent of nationalism, or is there an interest kind of in the class differentiations within the peasantry itself, and what role they might play in the revolution? I imagine, especially with regard to China, that there's a lot of discussion. So I'm just interested in what role does the peasantry play? And then the second question is a bit in relation to the international learning school and institutions like the University of the Territories of the East. I really liked how you talked about those not just as transmission belts, basically, of the Comintern line or something like that. I don't remember what your phrase was kind of like this side of transfer of knowledge or something like that. And yeah, where kind of, these actors who all actually had experience, right, in these different anti-colonial struggles kind of came together and developed knowledge. And yeah, and so I'm really interested, like, what would you say, what are some of the concepts, or like, how does this shape basically the thinking of the Korean communists?
Okay, let's start with the peasant side, yes. So, and communist analysis of peasant issue was very sophisticated. It was a major issue to be debated in Comintern journals. And the main actors in those debates would include Park Chin-sung, a major actor in Shanghai faction. So say who was an interesting person, because in the 1920s he also published under a pseudonym in Korea, in Korean, in colonial Korean journals. And he was publishing in Soviet Union. So Park Chin-sung was left nationalist. He was Shanghai person. And he believed that in the name of United Front, Chondogyo religion, which represented middling peasants in his view, should be taken as a partner of communists in Korea. So middling peasants should come on board in a way. However, there were other actors there. Choi Song-woo, a Soviet Korean cadre, who was more orthodox. He was analyzing Korean peasantry along those kulak, rich, middling, poor line. And he wanted to stress the struggles of the people whom he called rural proletarians, tenants. The thing is that colonial Korea was a country of tenancy. Tenancy rates were very high. Tenancy struggles were protracted, bitter, often lethal, deadly, lots of bitterness, lots of violence. And that was obviously something that communists thought they should work with. Here you have the report of Korean communists on their activity. And the party was saying that it was leading tenants movement here. So to say, tenants movement were important for Comintern and for the party. So then there were the people who wanted to stress tenants movement. So there were different tendencies. Generally, there was understanding that peasantry under capitalism, as Lenin already argued in Russian case, is being gradually split into different groups with antagonistic interests. There are richer peasants, middling and poor, and then there are tenants, factory hands, and then slash and burn agriculturalist, Hwajonmin, and so on. And then there are vagrants. So, and Comintern tried hard to analyze each and every of those groups on its own terms and understand what communists could do to lead their struggle. So no, attention was very keen. There was understanding that especially tenants could be very good ally for proletariat. Party wanted to very much concentrate its resources on tenancy disputes. So yeah, and I mean, even if you think about it from our today's perspective, probably was the right thing. So, and lots of interesting articles, Park Chin-sung, Choi Song-woo, but you also had Yang Myung, who published under the pseudonym Lee Gang. He published a number of good articles, sociological analysis of Korean peasantry. But the funny about Park Chin-sung, Choi Song-woo, and Yang Myung's writings is that this level of detail in the analysis was completely absent in American or Western publications on Korea. No one else did it. So, and then Comintern was the first ever group which actually tried to do sociological analysis of peasantry in colonial Korea. There were no one, I mean, the first really good American analysis of conditions in colonial Korean villages would be Andrew Grozdantsev's book about Korea. Well, Grozdancev was purchased during the Marxist. So, but that came much later. So it's interesting just how pioneering all that is. I don't know, the peasant question was important. And when it comes to the school, so transfer of the knowledge. The thing is that Profintern, the trade union arm of Comintern, was sending very detailed instruction to Korean workers how to do things. And then Koreans were educated at Kutv about how organizers come to the factory. They get jobs. What you do to organize the workers. How you build your first strike. How you gradually explain to the workers that economical struggle is not enough. How you politicize them. If there is already a union, how you capture union. How you get the union under your influence, how you build a Bolshevik faction in the existing union, what you do to capture the union, in a way, to capture the main positions in the union, and so on. So that was all those things that German communists have been doing, for example, communists in other countries were doing, and now Koreans were given very detailed instructions on how to do things. Well, it's not necessarily it worked in the same way in Korea, but again, having this sort of experience at your disposal is useful.
Hi. Can you hear me well? Okay. Hi, I'm a PhD candidate here at NYU as well. Thank you for the talk. I have a question about internationalism. I kind of came in just as you were talking about the Comintern. So I'm sorry if you had talked about this. But I wonder, because the 20s were this period where, the sort of question of nationalism, especially third world nationalism versus sort of Soviet socialist internationalism was being raised a lot at the congresses of the Comintern. And so I wonder how, if the Korean communists, because they were conceptualizing nationalism, did they engage with internationalism and in what way? Because I also read that, say, the Baku Congress, for example, they did participate in the Baku Congress.
No, they came to Moscow late in 1922. It was a Moscow Congress of the oppressed people.
Oh, okay, I see.
They came, it was a big delegation with lots of important people, including Yongson, by the way. He met Trotsky there.
That's cool. So yeah, so that's mostly my question, is how they sort of conceptualize nationalism.
Kukche-Jui internationalism, Kukche-Jui is Kokusai-shugi, basically. So as much of communist terminology in Korean is basically Japanese words pronounced in Korean. So no, Kukche-Jui was of enormous importance. It was completely central. Kukche-Jui was understood from several perspectives. First was the perspective of the global revolution. The understanding that Korean Revolution is part of a sort of big global process. Stalin could have switched to one country socialism or whatever he called it, but even Stalin never fully repudiated global revolutions. It was understood that Soviet Union had to do it first and then the world would follow. And Koreans never repudiated, of course, and Koreans were very keen to mention that revolution is a global element. So this was one thing. Another thing was the idea of supporting Soviet Union and defending Soviet Union, because this is proletariat's motherland. Because as long as Soviet Union exists, Korea has hope. This was also understood as international. Another thing was Chinese Revolution. After all, the biggest hope for Korea was their victory in China, and the understanding that then Korea would be liberated. So hundreds, thousands of Koreans fought for Chinese Revolution. I mean, if you only take Guangzhou Canton Commune, the failed uprising in Guangzhou, around 200 Koreans participated, including that famous guy, Chan Jirak Kim Sang, who is known for his book Aliran. And in Wales, basically, took down his confessions. And if you read Aliran, Nim Wales and Kim Sang's Aliran, you get a very interesting description of Canton Commune. Guangzhou uprising. So that was one case. There were Koreans who sacrificed themselves during the Long March. There were Koreans who worked and lived in Yan'an during the heroic Yan'an years. And the person who actually wrote the music for the best-known Chinese communist songs, like the March of the Eight Road Army, and so on, was a Korean, Chon Yul-sung, Jian Lui-chan. So it was an ethnic Korean who briefly worked in North Korea after the liberation, returned to China and died there. So he is one of China's best-known revolutionary composers. Funny thing is that his teacher was a former professor of St. Petersburg Conservatory of Music. He attended Shanghai Conservatory before going to Yan'an. So it's an interesting case also of a very globalized communist intellectual. So, and then you had also Korean detachment, so-called Korean volunteer corps, Chosun and Yongun, who were fighting political commissar at that time was, by the way, Comrade Deng Xiaoping, himself an alumni of KUT. So they were fighting at Taihanshan Mountain, massive building a liberated zone there during the anti-Japanese resistance war. So liberated zone in Taihanshan Mountains was a major project of Chinese Communist Party, but Koreans were very important there. So, and this was the understanding which what made it possible for Koreans to fight and die for Chinese revolution. A revolution is global always. We win in China than we win in Korea. So that was also Kuk Cheji. So no, it was extremely important. I would say it was crucial. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sun Yu. I'm not affiliated with the school, but I just maybe found the event on Facebook. But thank you for coming and a great talk. I have a question about my view is that those communists in 20s and 30s kind of romanticized recently in a Korean culture through some movies or those I think with some distance in time, they look more appealing or personally approachable for wide audience, not beside the leftists. That's my view, but I wonder if you kind of see the view has changed recently in Korean society, or if so, I wonder actually more wondering is whether you find some parallels in some other Western societies that the romanticizing old revolutionaries and having a psychological connection.
I don't think they are romanticized today in South Korea. Actually, very few. Well, but you see, it's not that it wasn't a general bestseller. I mean, left-wing people liked it. But I wouldn't say that it was necessarily what, say, people were talking about on the streets. There are several former communists who are sort of national icons in South Korea. One is Hong Bong-do, because of Hong Bong-do, a Korean guerrilla commander who later became Soviet Communist Party member, who is known for having met Lenin in 1922 and having got a pistol directly from Lenin as a gift, so personal pistol. So he was never present, and he lived in Xilota also and died there. So under Moon Jae-in, liberal president, his remains were transferred to South Korea. And for liberals, he became a sort of national hero. But when conservative president took power, then the statues of Hong Bong-do were thrown away from the official buildings since he was a communist. So that was one case. Perhaps otherwise, I would struggle to find a film in South Korea. I mean, I teach about South Korean popular culture. You see, in Oslo, students are not so interested in communist history. So I try to teach what students want to hear, and they want to hear about K-pop, K-dramas, K-films, and some say, okay, I teach them. I can research in free time about what I like, but I teach K-pop. So, but the thing is that during the K-drama or K-film dealing with communist movement personages, you will find a few where you have passing protagonists who were communists, like Seoul 1945 was a drama, and you have Park Hoon-young there. Okay, but he wasn't the main protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
So, looking at the films, you have this film, Park Pang-yeol, Shinminji anarchist, but Pang-yeol was not a communist, he was an anarchist. And he became quite conservative on the liberation, but then he went to North Korea. So, but he wasn't communist anyway. Then you have this interesting film, Amsal.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but again, we are dealing there with anarchists, Yoldan people, not communists. Yoldan was somewhere between anarchism and communism. They gravitated to communism in the end, but the tactic of individual terrorism was not communist. So it's terrorist.
This has
Anyway.
never happened before, sorry.
Lots of things are happening. In just a couple. Anyway, so, or you have another film, Milchong. And again, it's Yoldan, it's not communist. No, actually, if you want to make a film, I think in South Korea, it's unwritten condition, you should not make heroize a communist. No. So I wouldn't say they romanticize, it's possible now to talk about them at least neutrally. So to say, and in South Korea, the way in which communism is framed, if you want to get funding and research on communist movement, in your application, you have to write that you don't research on socialism, you research on independence movement. If you write this, you probably get money. So say, if you write that you research on communist movement, you better don't apply. So say, so no, they are not, you're right, they're not romanticized. Very few researchers in South Korea do communism, very few, around 10 people. So to say, but we have more researchers doing independence movement, and we socialist movement researchers, what we do is we join independence movement research and try to survive there. No, South Korea remains an anti-communist state officially. You cannot found a communist party in South Korea. So to say, so no, I wouldn't say they're heroized, actually. I wish it might have been the case. But what we have also in the West generally, I mean, since so much time lapsed, we have now second, well, it's not even Cold War, it's hot war now. So to say the old Cold War is long time ago, so it's no longer so important. So you can, for example, now say that American communists, for example, did so much to combat racism, that they were pioneers in the work for empowerment of Afro-Americans and so on. So now you can say this, that those people were basically fighters for justice. Well, you couldn't do, well, it might have been difficult to say some decades ago. So we became now a bit more objective because just time lapse. It's no longer actual. See, the empire has different enemies now. And maybe empire is just falling apart anyway. So to say, so all taboos are gone more or less. The same in South Korea. But they're not complicated.
My name is Kapsar. My name is Sarah. Thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry, I'm brave the subway. How important Korea in general and Asia in particular to Bolsheviks?
Asia was cardinally important.
We, for example, Trotsky wrote a bunch of stuff about China in 1920s, but after later years, he did not write anything about Asia, even though there was Japanese imperialism rising East Asia on the same scale with fascism in Europe. That's question number one. The question number two is, as we enter into 1930s, the debate in South Korea, Korean communists either became very speculative or just practical. Why don't we have any balanced analysis of Chosun Peninsula between practice and theory back then?
In 1930s,
We had age gone to the 1930, 1940, and then even 1980s. I mean, the 사고체 논쟁, social formation is very speculative. It doesn't have any implication to shop or rest of society.
It's an interesting question, which I myself think a lot about. And the first about the importance of Asia. China was of absolute importance. I mean, it was correctly understood in the 1920s that if Chinese revolution happens, it will change the world forever. So Chinese revolution was the pilot, the most important project of coming here. Everything related to Chinese revolution was under Stalin's personal control, so to say. So Chinese students had their own university, or Sun Yat-sen University of Chinese workers. So this, but even you see, 1942, 1943, Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. I mean, German troops were coming to Volga. They were stopped in Stalingrad. Even then, Soviet Union was sponsoring Chinese Communist Party in Yan'an to the tune of, say, approximately $1 million a year. So, and it needed money to buy arms. So to say, but it paid Chinese communists because it was a strategical future. It was understanding that if we win in China, then we win globally. So in this way, no, Asia, China especially was of paramount importance. India was important too, but in India, communists were very weak, unlike China. And why is it so was an important question. Korea was important in its own right because Kuomintang correctly understood that Korea has higher revolutionary potential than Japan proper. so that was correctly understood, actually. So Korea was seen important because of its geopolitical importance as a sort of area between China and Japan. So yes, I mean, Asia was, at least certain Asian countries were very much prioritized. But when it comes to this scholastic approach to the debates, I think Saguchil Nonjen especially was, well, basically all those musings about semi-feudal, what was it, a semi-feudal capitalism. And so on. I mean, in South Korea of the late 1980s, it was laughable. Where feudals, they were long gone. So the scholasticism was perhaps, I think, a result of the fact that socialism was for a very long time dormant. It only was resurrected in the 1980s. There was little experience. People simply didn't know how to collect data, analyze them, and proceed from data to conclusions. So it was easier to read old Japanese books where all the semi-feudal stuff was coming from. It was basically all about pre-war Japan. So it was easier to read old Japanese books and just follow to the letter what Kozaha people were saying in the 1930s about completely different conditions. So I think it had something to do with that. It's basically 1980s Korean socialist movement. Lots of historical experience was largely lost. There were young people who simply were not perhaps in position to collect data, analyze them independently. And they had to rely on what they could read in Japanese books, which, I mean, they were mostly relying on their reading knowledge of Japanese. So, and many of those Japanese books were just completely outdated. It wasn't easy to find the up-to-date contemporary Japanese Marxist literature in South Korea in the 1990s. So to say, you could get all the books in the libraries. Well, something like this.
Okay, so one last question, and
thank you for your talk. I'm a perspective Marxist student at Russian Studies. I'm very curious about when I talk about the anti-Heidegger thought of those Korean Marxists.
Heidegger.
Yeah. Like I was very curious about that because because the Japanese Marxists at around the same time also is like heavily influenced by like Joseph Jun, like he's also like heavily influenced by this like also has a kind of like enmity towards him. So I was just wondering if like did you discover any kind of like exchange between the Korean and Japanese Marxists about the category issue, or like the current Marxists that are like they actually develop this kind of
No,
approach
I mean,
directly German?
rather than exchange, I would say that Korean communists were learning from Japan all the time. So say Tosaka Junen it was must read. I mean, if you were communist, Marxist, socialist, it was a must read. Kawakami Hajime basically was textbook. I mean, all those texts by famous Sakai Toshihiko Kawakami, especially Kawakami Hajime, they were basically textbooks. So Korean communists and Marxists were of course learning from Japan, and as I have just mentioned here, I mean, the mentor to Korean intellectual Marxists was actually Japanese professor at Japanese Imperial University. So no, it rather than exchange, it was very much process of learning via Japan, I would say. Kaijusha, a progressive Japanese publisher, published collected works of Marx in the late 1920s. And about one half of all this came from Korea. It was a great place to sell Marxist literature, since the revolutionary movement was so strong. So Marxism largely came to Korea in translated form, translated to Japanese. And it's interesting, we have documents from red peasant unions, for example, the socialist peasant unions. And what we find there is that an important subject to teach peasants was basic Japanese, so that they would read Japanese Marxist books. So anti-colonial fighters were teaching Japanese to peasants in order to read Marxist literature. It's so ironic. That's how things were. So it wasn't exactly two-sided in a way, equal exchange. We have this equal exchange today, but today South Korea has higher purchasing power parity per capita incomes than Japan. It's richer countries than Japan also. So to say, so now we live in a different world.
Well, really, this was really an education, Professor Tikhonov. Thank you so much for this tour de force through the 20th century. And thank you all for coming and with your questions. And please, should you have questions for Professor Tikhonov, we'll probably hang around for 10-15 more minutes before we whisk him off to lunch. And yes, thank you.
Thank you. So